Good afternoon, buenas tardes, and welcome to the 24th Annual Library of Congress National Book Festival, a place where books build us up. I am Beatriz Haspel, Head of the Logistics of the Library of Congress National Library Services for the Blind and Print Disabled. We are joined this afternoon by Maria Arana, a prize-winning author and literary critic, and former literary director of the Library of Congress. Yes. Among her numerous books are the National Book Award finalist American Chica, the novels Cellophane and Lima Nights, the biography Bolivar, American Liberator, and a sweeping history of Latin America, Silver, Sword, and Stone. Her new book is titled Latino Land, a portrait of America's largest and least understood minority. She is in conversation with Maria Peña, a former journalist for outlets such as Univision, Telemundo, and NBC Latino, among others. She is now a public relations specialist at the Library of Congress, and I hope you enjoy the festival. Let's welcome them to our stage.
So thanks to everyone here. Thank you for joining us. I hope you get a lot out of this conversation because it will be an engaging conversation. This is the book that we're going to be talking about. It is a great overview of the history of Latinos in the US way before it was a country, their challenges, their hopes for the future, how we contribute to the US. It's very packed with a lot of information. Marie did a thorough research. She interviewed over 237 people across all parts of the Latino community, so it's a very engaging book. I recommend it. It's a timely topic, of course, because we are, 72 days away from Election Day. Very timely topic, and immigration, of course, for better or for worse, it is an immigration, it's an electoral topic. So I encourage you to read it. There's a lot to unpack, so I wanted to ask you, first of all, what inspired you to write this book?
Thank you, Maria. And first of all, I want to thank the Library of Congress for holding this festival, which is an incredible tribute. Thank you to you for coming on this beautiful day, and thank you to Beatriz for introducing us, and to Maria, who is a sister Latina from Nicaragua, and I'm so proud and happy to be in her company for this conversation. What prompted me to write this book? This has been a long journey for me. I have been in the books business for a long time. I was a journalist at the Washington Post. At every point along the way, this population was growing. In my lifetime, it has grown from 2.5 million to 64 million people. An extraordinary thing for me to be watching all along, and yet feeling all the way that we were invisible in some way, that we always were explaining ourselves in some way. When I worked for a book publishing company, was one of the biggest publishers, Simon & Schuster, I was never asked about the world of Latinos. Whenever I brought it up at an editorial meeting, I was told that Latinos don't read, so don't bring me your ideas about Latinos, bring me your ideas about everything else. And I got to the Washington Post, and they were curious. They were curious because there weren't that many. I was one of very few Latinos on staff at the Post. And I offered to be sent out, even though my job was for books, to be sent out and to talk to Latinos and talk to them in Spanish and bring to the paper stories about them, because that population was growing in Washington, in the area, and the Post, being a good journalistic institution, was curious about them. So at that point, I began to write books about every aspect of Latinos, starting with myself. My first book was a memoir because I was suddenly made aware of that little girl, 10 years old, who arrived in this country. And where did that little girl go? Because I had been erasing her ever since. So I wrote American Chica to remind myself of who that was. That was 24 years ago. I presented that book at the very first National Book Festival here 24 years ago.
Yes.
And so every other book has been a chapter of sorts. I wrote 2 novels, one a very broad, epic novel set in the Amazon jungle, another one a very short, sharp love story set in Lima, that was Lima Nights. And then I began to think, well, how can I tell the story of these people, the history of these people, and where we come from, where we've been, who we are? And I tried, it was kind of a parlor game that I played with myself. Who would tell that largest story? And I came to Simón Bolívar because his family had been in the hemisphere for 300 years before he decided to mount the revolution for independence of 6 republics. And he had traveled. I mean, he traveled 75,000 miles up and down the hemisphere on horseback to prosecute that revolution. So I thought that would be the way to put into human terms where we're from and where we come from. And then I went from there to dilating the story to the whole of Latin America with Silver Sword and Stone, which was really a portrait of the region as it was through history and why those things have not changed, and that you can recognize history in the population that lives today in Latin America. And then, of course, it was that population is here. We're here. We are 64 million. That started with 2.5 million. When it started, when I first arrived, and it was at 2.5 million, that population was largely Mexican, largely Central American, and people who had been here for generations. And now there was this wave that happened during my lifetime. And who were we? And we were by now the 2nd largest Spanish-speaking nation in the world. And so, you know, I don't know where to go after Latino land, because I mean, this is the broadest subject I've ever.
Well, you know, it was a massive undertaking. I mean, I could tell that you spent so much time researching it. You know, you left no stone unturned because there's just so much data in there. I actually saw a census report, an update a few weeks ago that's actually 65 million Hispanics now, close to 20% of the population. Latino land, why did you come up with that title? Or how did you come up with that title?
This is such a Latino story. Just a few months ago, well, it was actually my last birthday, which is in September. And I didn't have a title. I had no title. I was going through every silly assemblage of words you can imagine. And my editor kept saying, no, no, no. My publicist kept saying, no. My agent said, no. And I was desperate. And I got a call from my very dear, wonderful friend, Sandra Cisneros, who is here today in the main hall. And Sandra says, I'm going to be in Washington, D.C. I know it's your birthday. Let's have lunch for your birthday. So on my birthday, last September, I went to lunch with Sandra. We sat at an Indian restaurant, fabulous food, and she said, you look so depressed. What's going on with you? And I said, well, you know, first of all, tummy troubles, but also, I don't have a title for my book. And she said, here's what you do. Here is what you do. You go home, spend the rest of the day, have a very happy birthday, get into your pajamas, go to bed, turn off the light, look up and you think about the person that you love absolutely without limits, and you concentrate on that image. It can be also a thing that you love. It doesn't have to be a person, but if it's a person, better. So I did that. I got in my pajamas. I got into bed. I turned off the light. It had been a very nice birthday, thank you, except for this problem that I had. And I look up, and I think about the person that I love without any conditions, unconditional love. And then I go to sleep. And I wake up in the morning, Latino land is in my head. Okay, that's part of the story. That's only part of the story. So I call up Sandra immediately and I say, I have a Latino land. And she said, that's fabulous. That's it, that's it, that's it. I call up my editor. That's it, that's it. Publicist, agent, they all say that is the title. Wonderful. Okay, great. A few months later, my editor calls and says, you have to come to New York because we have to have a conversation. And I said, okay. So I came to New York. It's not too far, Washington, D.C., drive 4.5 hours. And I'm sitting with him at lunch, and Bob says, here's what I have to tell you. We're speeding up the publication. You're going to have 2 days with the pages. You're going to have 2 days with the proofs. You're going to have 3 days with this. And you're going to have to do everything very quickly because we're speeding up the publication because it's election year. So I said, that's fine. And so I said, when's pub date? And he says, February 20th. And I almost fall off my chair. That is the birthday of my father, and that is the person that I thought of when I looked up. So he gave me the title. And as I say, that's a total Latino brujeria. Just wonderful.
Thank you so much. It's such an intimate story. You know, it almost gets me teary-eyed because a lot of us were probably not lucky to have beautiful fathers like that in our lives. But thank you so much for sharing that story. So, you know, you talk about Latino land, a country unto itself almost, that if it were a country, we would be the 5th largest economy in the world. That's how powerful we are, right? With our purchasing power and all of that. But you said that we are also a people with no name. Explain what you meant by that.
We've been given all these names. We've never really announced a name for ourselves. I remember coming at the age of 10 to Summit, New Jersey, and where there were no Hispanics at all except for my family that I could see. And I remember being called a Mexican. And that was fine with me, but I wasn't. So I would say, well, I've never met a Mexican. And people would say, that's okay, you're Mexican, you speak Spanish. And so, you know, from then on, then suddenly Nixon was in the White House. He needed to be reelected. He hadn't had a very good turnout from among Latinos in the first go round. And he wondered why. You know, why? Because I'm from California, he said. I'm from California. I'm not only California, but my father was a grocer. I worked with Latinos. I, you know, piled fruit from their gardens and and vegetables from their fields into my father's truck. I worked with them. I know them. Why didn't they vote for me in big numbers? And so he was the one. President Nixon was the one who established Hispanic Heritage Month, Hispanic Heritage Day, who gave us really the name of Hispanics, who insisted then, because he brought Hispanics to his first White House, and said, what do I need to do? And the Hispanic advisor said, you need to have Hispanic generals, you need to have Hispanic bishops, you need to have Hispanics in the White House. And Nixon did. So this is, you know, this strange, wonderful way that we were given the name Hispanics. Then we became Latinos. And we became Latinos, which is really not a great name for us because it was imposed really by Napoleon, of all people, when Napoleon had his eye on Mexico and on really moving into the hemisphere in a very large way, he appealed to Hispanics, to South Americans, to the Latin American world by saying, you know, we are Latin. You're like us. You're like French. You're like, you know, we're all the same thing. We come from Latin blood. And so the word Latino became, and Latin America came from that time. And so that was an imposition as well. And now, of course, we have the variations, which are Latinx. Very few of us use the term Latinx, but it's very much in the academy. And people prefer it because it's gender equal. And now we have Latine, which is another variety of Latino, Latinx, Latine, because it is a vowel at the end. We don't like X. I mean, don't X us, right? So there is a nice vowel at the end, and now it's Latine. So these are all names that have been imposed on us by Nixon, by Napoleon, by the academic word, by the U.S. Census, and we are, in a certain way, a people who have never chosen the name for ourselves. Most of us say Nicaraguense, a Nicaraguan American, a Peruvian American, a Mexican American. Most of us identify ourselves that way.
I found, yeah, that was one of the things that I found striking in the book, because it was surprising to me to know that Nixon was the one that started courting the Hispanic vote way back then. And it's really interesting because we're so diverse. You talk about multiplicity and like the complexity of the Hispanic community, because we're from everywhere and we're now everywhere in the US. And so being so distinct, yet we find a way to forge unity. So I was wondering, why do you think, or to the American public in general, why is it important to understand the largest minority in the US at this point?
First of all, because we have been invisible for so long. Second of all, because we are so productive. This is the one thing that absolutely thrilled me and impressed me and inspired me in writing this book. There are, as Maria has said, 237 people I talked to at every level of society, of the Latino world. People from menial workers on the street, construction people I would stop and talk to, people who were grape pickers, who started their lives as picking peaches in California, who then became one of the greatest neurosurgeons we have in this country. The importance of this population, the story of the advancement, the dedication, the work ethic, all of that is so lost, I think, in the conversation, because people think of us, first of all, as being poor, as being a burden on society. We are not a burden on the society. We are, without the GDP that you mentioned, we produce $3.5 trillion for the economy. It is an astonishing amount. We have the greatest percentage, the greatest growth of small businesses in this country is in Latino hands. This is an enormous productive engine for this country, and it is, to me, it has been an inspiration to see how the generations move, because you can start as a menial worker, but you can have children who go to college. You can have grandchildren who become professionals in their fields, and you see this story all the time. It is a tremendously mobile population. And I think that what inspires me most to write about this book is the invisibility. Why do we have to explain ourselves all the time? Why do we have to say we're here? We count. And for a long time, I think it has been the reason why getting people to vote, getting Latinos to vote, was a project, because people felt well, nobody cares about me, nobody cares about my children, nobody cares about my life. This is a tremendous population that needs to be invested in by this country and appreciated by this country. That's my whole reason for, my whole mission right now. And to get this in, and if I may say one more thing, to get this in the schoolrooms, because Latino school children don't know the pride that they could have. You know, hearing Sandra Cisneros this morning, or just earlier, talking about her life and the shame that she felt as a child, which is heartbreaking, because this is a people who have been here since before the American Revolution. The contributions have been extraordinary. School children need to know their own history, and I think this is my largest project.
And I think that's an important point to make, because that was one of the questions that kept coming up to me as I read the book. You know, we remain invisible, little understood, despite the fact that we are, by 2060, we're going to be a third of the population. 1 out of every 3 Americans will be of Latino origin. And so my question to you would be, what role do teachers and school districts have or can have in making sure that Latinos do not remain invisible?
Well, I think the biggest issue here is that we are part of the American story. And if you don't know that as a Latino, and a lot of people don't know that, certainly the school children don't know that, we have been, first of all, on this territory that is the United States since the 1500s. And before that, because we have a lot of indigenous blood. I have a great majority of my DNA is indigenous. So this is a population that has been here for millennia. And then you have, of course, the Spanish presence that was here from, coming from Mexico. The Spanish population came up in, what was it, 1501. 1532 was when, of course, Mexico was invaded, really, by Cortés. And so the Mexican population that began to come up was in, I think it was 1601, was the expedition that came up and was the first Spanish injection. And a lot of those people who came up, and the population of New Mexico, Arizona, for instance, is filled with generations that have been here since that time. Linda Chavez, who worked, I write about her, who worked in the Reagan White House, who was the first Hispanic to work in the White House. She came from a family that came up with the expedition 1601. So this is a presence that has been here a very long time. And it is the issue of history that is not told in the classrooms. For instance, George Washington himself said that he could not have won the Revolutionary War had it not been for the Spaniards and the Spanish help that came up the Mississippi River when the English blockade had taken over the coast, and the only way that the ammunition could come up for the patriots, for the rebels, was through Spanish ships and Spanish hands. And Galveston is named after Galvez, Bernardo Galvez, who was the commander at the time in Louisiana, who allowed this to happen and was a huge help. So starting from the American Revolution, we have a history here. Latinos fought in the Civil War, great heroics. In fact, do you remember, you probably were taught this in your history class, damn the torpedoes, full speed ahead. And who was that? That was a Latino. That was an admiral who is known, whose statue stands in 4 blocks from the White House, and you go and you see him there, and you see his bust in the Army-Navy Club, but nobody tells you that this admiral was Latino. His father had fought in the Revolutionary War. So you have all of this history, and a huge military presence from then on, all the way through the world wars, all the way through the Vietnam War, through the Korean War. Great heroics, really, by the Latino population. But this isn't learned in the classrooms.
And I think, yeah, and I also think there's also individual responsibility, right? So to reach out to your neighbors, to, share your stories. You bring up a lot of important issues in the book. One of them being that we continue to be underrepresented in a lot of segments of society. There's no equity. And so, of course, you have a lot of individual success stories and trailblazers. But as a collective, there's still a lot of room to grow and a lot further to go. So what is it going to take for Latinos to stop counting the first this, the first that? In a lot of our families, we are the first this, the first that. But we also want to get to a point where we no longer have a need to talk about that. So what do you think it's going to take to go beyond the trailblazer success story?
I think it's going to take a lot of first of all, political action. There's no question about that. Joaquin Castro, who is a representative from Texas, is going around all the time speaking to the media corporations, to Hollywood, to book publishers, to magazine publishers, to journalists, and saying, why are we not more present in this story? And why aren't there more Latinos on boards, corporate boards in this country? Right now, we are 1% to 2% on boards of corporations in this country, which is almost ridiculous because we were saying in the same breath, this is the fastest growing small businesses in the country are owned by Latinos. So it takes political power. It takes first of all, it takes political power. Where does that come from? It comes from education. It comes from being aware of who the population is and where it has gone. And you're right. There's a lot of talk about the first people to go to the college, the first people to get on a board, the first Hispanic to be on the editorial staff of the Washington Post. I'm sure that was same for you in your journalistic career. But they're there, and they're happy. This is a population that is little by little, year by year. Obviously, if we've grown from 2.5 million to 65 million in my lifetime, we are also going to college, going to Ivy League schools, becoming doctors, becoming people who you hopefully will see more and more in the media. But that takes work. And that takes people being more aware of the population, and that takes coming out of the invisibility that I'm talking about.
So one quick question before we move on to our section for our Q&A, because I know a lot of you will have questions. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of time for that. But a quick question, immigrants like myself, like many in the room here, have always had this tension between assimilation and maintaining cultural identity. What is the case for US-born Hispanics in terms of the challenge of keeping that cultural identity?
Huge challenge because there is such a thing as cultural attrition. It's nothing new. It happened to the German Americans, it happened to the Irish Americans, it happens to the Swedish Americans. We all blend eventually. With Latinos, it's different because we are an ethnicity that has every racial mix in the book. We are, and I have done my DNA, and I have every race of man in me. I have Black African, I have Indigenous, I have Asian, and I have Caucasian. So, we are the biggest mix. We look like a variety unto ourselves. We are diversity written large, just as a population. So the attrition that comes with a German American or a Swedish American or a Danish American is not going to be the same as for us, because there is a racial component to our presence, and a racial component, frankly, to the way that we're kept out. And it's been not too long ago that we were kept out of intermarriage, that we were kept out of bar rooms, restaurants, etc. There were signs just as recently as the 60s when I arrived that, that said, no Mexicans, no dogs. And so that would incline one to not be associated with Latinos. And I think that that's, the cultural attrition is one thing. Another thing is that we're in an ethnicity that most intermarries. I mean, Pew Research has done all of this incredible work. I'm so grateful to them to you know, absolutely parse the population. But we are the population that most intermarries, which is to say what? That, you know, maybe in a household, the two parents don't speak English, or don't speak Spanish, excuse me. And also, you have to say that you and I, Maria, we were born abroad. The great majority of Hispanics were born here. 70% of Hispanics were born here. So you have this population of, you know, about 80% that speak English fluently, and only a very small percentage that don't speak it fluently or don't speak it at all. So you have little by little, the generations fall off. I have a daughter-in-law who is Mexican-American 100%, whose family is one of those who has been here since the 1600s, and she doesn't speak Spanish. And she's not teaching her children Spanish. So little by little, we become more Americanized. A lot of us manage to, and this is certainly true for my daughter-in-law, manage to keep hold of that culture even though the language may be fading.
So I'm gonna, we only have 10 minutes, unfortunately, so I think that's gonna give us enough for maybe a couple of questions, unfortunately. So you're welcome to come up and ask Marie a question.
Hi there. Thank you so much for coming and talking to us. Something that you mentioned and that you did with your book on Simon Bolivar was to create this massive cultural work for the people who, like for the Hispanics and everything, who live in the U.S. in English, which is something that doesn't really exist. Like for instance, like me, I was born in Venezuela, and I grew up, Simon Bolivar and all these people. And since I was born there, I had moved here when I was 14 or so. But I had learned the history, I had learned all these things. But for my cousins, for instance, they were sort of born here, and you see that, I'm from there, but I don't really know the history. And then you sort of get that sense of they feel weird about this sort of thing, and you sort of need this work of media and movies and books in English or in Spanish, but for these people who live in the U.S. So I'm curious, what advice would you give for someone like me who just would like to be part of that creation of work for these people in a new way that's not necessarily victimized, and you're sort of okay, here's a history, how do we actually go about it and just sort of feel good but also be part of the U.S.?
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that question. That's such an important question, and so important that you want to be part of that. The bringing the culture here and to make it part of the American story. It is part of the American story. I mean, it is. The media doesn't tell us so. Hollywood certainly doesn't tell us so. As just within the last, I think, 5, maybe 10 years, we are beginning to see Hispanics as we truly are. Before we were villains, or we were the lazy ones sitting under the cactus tree. But this work, which needs to be done by Hispanics themselves, Latinos like you, who are aware of the culture before, who have an appreciation for the Simon Bolivars of the world that gave this hemisphere so much of its history, to bring it here and to serve not only as teachers, but as people who work in the media. We don't have enough of you in the media. We don't have enough of you in Hollywood. We don't have enough of you in the classroom. We don't have enough of you teaching Latino children like the child that you used to be. And I think that that is a huge project at hand. And it needs to be undertaken by all of us who care about it. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. And please try to keep your questions short because we are running out of time, and they're very strict up there. So your question is next.
Hello. As the Hispanic community is continuing to grow, how beyond the language is such a huge factor of preserving our culture into the next generation. What are other ways that you would recommend that we preserve our culture, but also embrace this, embracing our American culture, but also our Latino culture together for futures to come?
I would say, thank you for that question. That's a lovely question. Our culture of family, our culture, our work ethic, our culture of togetherness. I mean, the food alone, la comida, de veras, the food, the music, our sense of community, all of these things that are so important to us, and that are something that we offer and that we give to the larger population. We are, in so many ways, a spark that's yet to take flame. And I wish more than anything for that flame of humility, courage, resilience, work to really be spread into the larger American sphere. And I think that people like us who care about these things, who care about family, who care about work, who care about sticking to it and making better generations after us is a great contribution to this country. And I think that we need to keep it alive. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. You're next. And
Hi.
you're probably the last question. I'm sorry.
So
We have? Okay.
I was very curious about how your book looks into the impact of social media and cultural evolution. Where I'm getting at is I read about something called the migrant capsule effect, where a migrant community comes to the U.S. and in a lot of ways, that community, that household, they maintain like a snapshot of their culture from the home country. Now, for me, as a second generation Mexicano, as a millennial, I feel that there's like this rapid pace of change within even my own community. And I'm curious how social media has really catalyzed that. Again, as a millennial, I've been able to connect with other Latinos in other colleges, in other states, and even in other countries. Now, what role is social media playing in accelerating that pace of change within our culture?
It has been amazing. Thank you for that question. It has been an amazing effect because when I look back at my father and my mother's life, where they were writing letters and it was taking months, and the culture was so far away that now it's immediate. I mean, you can get on WhatsApp, you can call your family in Mexico, and I can call my family in Lima, and you can be in touch in a way that you weren't before, and you can keep those connections, and we do. I mean, we send money back. We keep the family's connections alive. I think social media has been an enormous effect on our being able to preserve the culture in the ways that my parents' generation could not. So this is a very important part of our culture, and we have to develop that even more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're next.
Hi. This is my own theory, but I've read so many books like Che by John Anderson and a beautiful book, Cuba, An American Story by Ana Ferrer, and the history of the United States in
We
Latin
only have
America.
a few minutes, so
Yeah,
if you
okay,
can
so
go
my
straight to your
thing
question.
is, I think some of the problem with invisibility and people not knowing Latinos is because our people don't know the history of the U.S. in so many countries and how much we've undermined democracy in so many countries. And so I think that's a part of why it's been harder for Latinos to adapt.
That's a very
you for-
good point. That is a very good point, and I'll be very, very brief in answering it. The reason why we have had this wave of immigration has, in many, many ways, been connected to the American hand in Latin America. And I mean a hand that has not been particularly contributing. It has, thank you for that question. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap it up. I want to give you the last word, but before I do that, I strongly recommend that you buy and read the book. I think it should be required reading in the classroom. Last words for you, Marie, and thank you for coming.
I just want to thank you also for coming and for being willing to listen to this extraordinary story that we're going to hear a lot more about. So thank you.